Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 7 October 2024. It is the 124th anniversary of the birth of Herbert Butterfield, or rather, I should say, Sir Herbert Butterfield, who was born in Oxenhope, England, on this date in 1900. Butterfield's primary claim to fame lies in his book, The Whig Interpretation of History, which has been quite influential among historians. Butterfield's book immediately established Whiggish history as a term of historiographical abuse. Here's how the influence of this book was described in a paper by Wilson and Ashplant in their 1988 paper, Whig History and Present-Centered History. Quote, "The importance of that essay is not just that it attained the status of a classic in Butterfield's own lifetime and has continued to be reprinted for over 50 years. Its main significance is that the historical profession in Britain came to accept its polemical terminology. The phrase Whig history has long been used as a term of historiographical criticism in such a way as to imply, firstly, that everyone knows what it means, and secondly, that no one wants to be Whiggish. This usage is much in accordance with Butterfield's intentions. He succeeded in implanting the term in the professional language of historians," unquote. No historian since Butterfield's book has wanted to be tarred with the brush of Whiggish history. But what did Butterfield mean by Whiggish history? He wrote, quote, "It is part and parcel of the Whig interpretation of history that it studies the past with reference to the present, and though there may be a sense in which this is unobjectionable if its implications are carefully considered, and there may be a sense in which it is inescapable, it has often been an obstruction to historical understanding because it is taken to mean the study of the past with direct and perpetual reference to the present," unquote. But it's not just studying the past with reference to the present. There is usually an element of progressivism mixed in. Quote, "There is a sense in which the Whig historian sometimes seems to believe that there is an unfolding logic in history, a logic which is on the side of the Whigs and which makes them appear as cooperators with progress itself," unquote. So we can distinguish two theses of one of the Whiggish historian judging the past in light of the present, and the other that the judgment is based on a principle of progress that seems to culminate in the present. We can also make a further distinction between two versions of the progress thesis, one in which the present is understood to fully embody the culmination of progress, and one in which progress represents progress in comparison to the past, but the future promises further progress and will be better than the present. We can identify this second version with the idea of the infinite perfectibility of man that appeared during the Enlightenment. Condorcet embodied this thesis on progress. Many critics of Hegel have identified his views with the first version of progress, in which the present has already attained perfection, though I wouldn't myself credit this view to Hegel. So I will mention once again what I have mentioned in several previous episodes, that Arthur Lovejoy identified the philosophies of history of Herder, Kant, Lessing, and Schiller, all Germanophone philosophers of the late 18th and early 19th century, as progressivist. And I have noted a parallel in the Francophone tradition of philosophy that consists of Turgot, Condorcet, Voltaire, and Guizot. But these were philosophers, and Butterfield was more interested in historians and what historians were doing. In hindsight, the height of folly of Whiggish history has been frequently assigned to the 19th century English historian Thomas Babington Macaulay. Macaulay has become the poster child of Whiggish history, though I don't think this is an entirely accurate assessment. But certainly Macaulay does discuss progress. Twice in volume 1 of Macaulay's 5-volume The History of England from the Accession of James II, Macaulay has appealed to the progress of civilization. Quote, in the monarchies of the Middle Ages, the power of the sword belonged to the prince, but the power of the purse belonged to the nation, and the progress of civilization, as it made the sword of the prince more and more formidable to the nation, made the purse of the nation more and more necessary to the prince, unquote. And in the following fascinating passage, which I've cut way back, so it's not quite so long, about the city of Bath, discusses the improved housing in the city. Quote, readers who take an interest in the progress of civilization and of the useful arts will be grateful to the humble topographer who has recorded these facts and will perhaps wish that historians of far higher pretensions had sometimes spared a few pages from military evolutions and political intrigues for the purpose of letting us know how the parlors and bedchambers of our ancestors looked, unquote. Before that passage, he had described how the housing was for Bath in the past and how much agreeable it was in the present. And here we can see Macaulay was interested not in some abstract and ideal conception of progress, and not with political progress, but with the mundane manifestation of progress in the ordinary business of life. Reading the passage about Bath, I was reminded of Boswell's Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides, which was published in 1785, almost 3/4 of a century prior to Macaulay's work, in which he recorded Dr. Johnson's and his, Boswell's, appreciation of the comforts of civilization. Quote, we were favored with Sir James Colquhoun's coach to convey us to the evening to Cameron, the seat of Commissary Smollett. Our satisfaction of finding ourselves again in a comfortable carriage was very great. We had a pleasing conviction of the commodiousness of civilization and heartily laughed at the ravings of those absurd visionaries who have attempted to persuade us of the superior advantages of a state of nature, unquote. This is a theme that's found throughout Boswell's writings about Samuel Johnson, who seems to have rarely missed an opportunity to take issue with Rousseau's primitivism. The relevance here is the progress of the useful arts, which is appreciated by Macaulay no less than by Boswell and Johnson. Perhaps we would have a kinder appreciation of Whiggish history if we focused on the development of the useful arts rather than focusing on the development of political progress, moral progress, and spiritual progress, all of which pose problems that are rather more intractable than progress in the useful arts. Macaulay himself can also be read as a critic of Whiggish history, as in the following passage. Quote, we read in our Saxon chronicles of the tyrants who, when at the height of greatness, were smitten with remorse, who abhorred the pleasures and dignities which they had purchased by guilt, who abdicated their crowns, and who sought to atone for their offenses by cruel penances and incessant prayers. These stories have drawn forth bitter expressions of contempt from some writers who, while they boasted of liberality, were in truth as narrow-minded as any monk of the Middle Ages, and whose habit was to apply to all events in history of the world the standard received in the Parisian society of the 18th century, unquote. The charge of Whiggish history is, after all, the charge of judging all history by a contemporary standard, which is to be understood as the norm by which all history is to be judged. And here we find Macaulay condemning this in its earlier form of judging medieval tyrants by the standards of Parisian society of the 18th century. Butterfield himself doesn't mention Macaulay in his book, The Whig Interpretation of History, but he does discuss Macaulay in The Englishman and His History. However, Macaulay's appearance in Butterfield's The Englishman and His History is not a takedown of Macaulay as a vulgar representative of Whiggish history or an uncritical prophet of progress, but as a representative of continuity rather than of progress. Quote, Macaulay refers to the fact that England has always taken particular pride in the maintenance of her institutional continuity. Our statesmen and lawyers have been under the influence of the past to a greater degree than those of other countries. From the 17th century, our greatest innovators have tried to show that they were not innovators at all, but restorers of ancient ways. And so it is that even when we have a revolution, we look to the past and try to carry it out in accordance with ancient precedents, unquote. So Macaulay, according to Butterfield, is a historian of continuity, not of progress. So that means, in turn, that Macaulay probably isn't the best cautionary tale to be told when it comes to Whiggish history, but I wanted to mention him because he is so often cited in this connection. Butterfield wrote many books in addition to his work on Whiggish history, among them History and Human Relations, a section of which was anthologized in Hans Meyerhoff's well-known little book, The Philosophy of History in Our Time. Meyerhoff introduces the Butterfield excerpt as followed, quote, Butterfield argues that the historian should not indulge in moral judgments, partly because we know so little about the secret motives hidden in the human heart, partly because of the Christian maxim, judge not, lest ye be judged, unquote. This caution, or this cautionary approach to history, is of a piece with Butterfield's critique of Whiggish history, which judges the past in light of the present. So here's an excerpt from History and Human Relations, which focuses on the role of moral judgment in history. Quote, if we consider these facts, if we note that the nature of the questions which the technical procedure of the historian is intended and qualified to answer, if we bear in mind the intellectual realm in which that kind of question is appropriately discussed, we are in a position to embark upon an estimate of the place which moral judgments ought to have in history. And in view of the situation that has been described, it may be possible to reduce the shock sometimes produced by the thesis, which denies any ethical character, in the usual sense of these words, to the technical historian's universe, unquote. Here, Butterfield introduces the figure of the technical historian, who is presented as an historian concerned only to get the story right, without any moral judgment at all made on the events that he narrates. Butterfield elsewhere calls technical history, quote, the sort of history which is the subject of a high and austere academic discipline. It may never exist in its absolute purity, but its assertions have a higher authenticity insofar as the ideal is attained, unquote. In several episodes, I've talked about the problem of moralizing history, and historicism has been one response to this. Rather than judge the past by the present, we judge the past by its own standards. But Butterfield doesn't take up the banner of historicism. He is nevertheless emphatic that historians must not render moral judgments on the past, but he doesn't make that claim on behalf of historicism. Butterfield also doesn't take up the banner of objectivity, which many historians who share Butterfield's rejection of moralizing about the past take up. Butterfield blazes his own trail, a trail that he shares at times with historicism and at times with those who demand objectivity, but is still his own trail. Instead, Butterfield has the figure of the technical historian, as well as what he calls scientific history. Quote, moral judgments on human beings are by their nature irrelevant to the inquiry and alien to the intellectual realm of scientific history. It has practical significance in that, granted such a view of the matter, these moral judgments must be recognized to be an actual hindrance to inquiry and reconstruction. They are, in fact, the principal reason why investigation is so often brought to a premature halt, unquote. It certainly is true that moral judgments on history are a hindrance to historical inquiry and reconstruction, which may be the source of his choice not to explicitly invoke historicism or objectivity. Quote, Yet we do not deny the importance of morality in life any more than we deny the hand of God in history. If we decide to conduct technical history without this postulate, on the contrary, we shall find that, At the last stage of the argument, the historical realm emerges as a moral one in what we may regard as a higher sense of the word altogether. Indeed, we may say that precisely because all men are sinners, and precisely because the rest of the truth about the matter cannot be disentangled short of the judgment day, the vindication of the moral element in history neither requires nor permits the separation of the sheep from the goats by the technical historian. Precisely because the issue is so important, and precisely because life is a moral matter every inch of the way, while no historian can keep his ethical vigilance continuous or troubled to be making moral judgments absolutely all the time. Precisely for these reasons, the occasional dip into moral judgments is utterly inadequate to the end it purports to serve. So Butterfield is subordinating what we usually think of as the moral judgments made by historians to a larger moral framework in which, compared to which, the moral judgments of the historian pale. In another passage from Butterfield's Christianity and History, Butterfield looks toward this bigger picture and contrasts it to the above focus on scientific history that embodies what we might compare to Max Weber's ideal of value-free inquiry. Quote, "It is true that technical history and historical research only comprise a specialized part of our attitude to the past, and their realm is restricted by the character of the apparatus which they use and the kind of evidence which is available. They provide us with a reasonable assurance that certain things did happen, and they happened in a certain order, and that certain connections exist between them, independent of any philosophy or creed of ours. But for the fullness of our commentary on the drama of human life and time, we have to break through this technique, have to stand back and see the landscape as a whole. And for the sum of our ideas and beliefs about the march of ages, we need the poet and the prophet, the philosopher and the theologian," unquote. Butterfield places an almost insuperable demand on the historian. As a technical historian, he is to focus on the work of history without being hindered by moral judgments. At the same time, the historian is to be a poet, a prophet, a philosopher, and a theologian. Elsewhere in History and Human Relations, Butterfield says that the historian must strive for imaginative sympathy, but even in striving, he will never be fully successful. He wrote, quote, "The only understanding we ever reach in history is but a refinement, more or less subtle and sensitive, of the difficult and sometimes deceptive process of imagining oneself in another person's place," unquote. We could take this as an epitaph upon Collingwood's philosophy of history, which is focused on the imaginative reenactment of past historical figures. Butterfield is saying that we must attempt this reenactment, but we will always fail to achieve a perfect resemblance to the past. Because we cannot really penetrate into the past in the way that Collingwood suggests that we can, we must not judge it as historians. However, when we come to history not as technical historians, we judge according to our metaphysical grasp of the world. And this is the other reason why we must not judge history as historians. Ultimately, historical judgment is superfluous. No one is going to be convinced by the historian, nor will anyone be dissuaded by the historian of the rightness or wrongness of some action that an historian recounts. These judgments of rightness and wrongness flow from a source that is extra-historical. Whether a human being is capable of being a technical historian in Butterfield's sense, and then turning around to reconnect with his overall metaphysical view of the world, and then entering into a judgment, is an interesting question. Butterfield implies that this is possible, but certainly the task he assigns to the historian is a difficult one, and few historians would measure up. Happy birthday, Herbert Butterfield, and thanks for listening.